It all started innocently enough, at least that's what I believed at the time. I grew up in a pretty standard home, or so it seemed. My father had married my stepmom when I was about 12. After my mother passed away, my stepmom Julie was a decade younger than my dad, vibrant and full of life, which was a stark contrast to my dad, who, though a great man, was pretty conservative and old-fashioned. By the time I turned 18, things started to feel different. My relationship with Julie had always been somewhat distant. I respected her, but we didn't have that deep bond you'd expect between a parent and child. She wasn't particularly maternal, but she tried in her own way, mostly by keeping the house in order and making sure my dad was happy. I couldn't fault her for that. But there were always subtle signs that I brushed off as just the dynamic of a blended family. I didn't have any siblings, and Julie didn't have kids of her own, so it was just us, navigating an awkward family unit. Julie had this one friend, Sarah. She was a regular presence at the house far more often than my dad even realized, as he worked long hours at his firm. Sarah and Julie had been friends for years, long before Julie even met my dad. Sarah was attractive, confident, and single, constantly regaling us with her tales of dating misadventures and parties. She and Julie had a certain bond, and sometimes I felt like an outsider in my own home when they were together. They would laugh at inside jokes, whisper, and look over at me in a way that made me feel like I was under some microscope. I didn't think much of it. After all, Julie had every right to have a close friend, and I tried not to read too much into it. But one night, everything changed, and it left me questioning everything I knew about betrayal, boundaries, and trust. It was a Friday evening when things began to spiral. My dad was out of town on a business trip, which wasn't unusual. He traveled frequently, and I was used to the empty house, save for Julie, who would usually retreat to her room early, leaving me to my video games or Netflix marathons. That night, though, Julie invited Sarah over, which wasn't particularly odd until they invited me to hang out with them in the living room. "We're going to have a few drinks and watch some movies," Julie said with a smile that seemed warmer than usual. "You should join us, make it a little family night." I hesitated at first. It wasn't often that Julie wanted to spend time together, and it was even rarer that she'd invite me to hang out when Sarah was over. Usually they preferred their own girl time, gossiping about who knows what. But I agreed, not wanting to seem rude. We sat down, the three of us on the couch, with a couple of bottles of wine open on the table. I wasn't much of a drinker, but they poured me a glass anyway, laughing as they insisted I loosen up a bit. We started watching some rom-com that I wasn't really paying attention to, and the conversation quickly shifted from the movie to random topics. Julie and Sarah were getting more and more tipsy as the night wore on, and I was trying to keep up, though my tolerance was nowhere near theirs. At some point, the conversation turned a bit more personal. Julie and Sarah started talking about relationships, specifically cheating. I don't know how the topic came up, but once it did, it took on a life of its own. "I just don't get why people make such a big deal about cheating," Sarah said casually, swirling her wine in her glass. "Like everyone does it. People just don't admit it." I laughed nervously, unsure how to respond. Julie nodded along with Sarah's words, which surprised me. My dad had always seemed like the old-fashioned, one-woman-for-life type of guy, and I assumed Julie shared the same values. But the more she drank, the more she seemed to agree with Sarah's perspective. "It's true," Julie said, glancing over at me. "People act like it's the worst thing in the world, but sometimes things just happen. It's human nature." I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. This wasn't a conversation I wanted to be part of, especially with my stepmom, but Sarah kept pushing the topic, asking me questions about my own experiences. "So, you've got a girlfriend, right?" Sarah asked, leaning in a little too close for comfort. No, not really," I replied, trying to play it off casually. "Just focusing on school right now." Julie laughed softly. "Oh, come on, there's no way a guy like you isn't getting some attention." It felt weird, like they were both in on some joke I wasn't privy to. The tension in the room grew thicker, and I could feel my face getting hotter, not just from the alcohol. I wanted to excuse myself, but I felt trapped in the situation, like something was happening just beneath the surface, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Then Sarah leaned in closer, her hand resting on my thigh in a way that was far from innocent. I froze. My heart started racing, and I could barely process what was happening. Julie didn't say anything. She just sat there, watching, her eyes flickering between me and Sarah. "You're tense," Sarah whispered, her voice low and teasing. "You need to relax." I glanced over at Julie, expecting her to stop this, to say something, but she didn't. Instead, she smiled a slow, knowing smile that sent chills down my spine. It was like she was in on something, and I was the one being toyed with. I tried to stand up, to make an excuse, but Sarah grabbed my arm and pulled me back down onto the couch. "Don't be shy," she murmured. "We're all just having fun here." I was confused, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of the situation. Was this some kind of test? A joke? But the looks on their faces told me this was very real, and I had no idea how to get out of it. Julie finally spoke, her voice soft but firm. "It's okay," she said. "You're not doing anything wrong." Her words sent a jolt through me. How could this be okay? How could any of this be happening? But before I could protest, Sarah's lips were on mine, and my brain shut down. I didn't kiss her back, at least, not at first. I was too shocked, too overwhelmed. But she was persistent, and my body reacted before my mind could catch up. I pulled away, my heart pounding in my chest, but Julie just watched, her expression unreadable. "Relax," Julie said again, her tone soothing, almost motherly, which made the whole thing even more twisted. "We're just having a good time." I wanted to leave, to run out of the house and never look back, but something held me there. Maybe it was the alcohol, maybe it was the confusion, or maybe it was something deeper, a fear of what this would mean for my relationship with Julie, with my dad, with everything. Sarah's hand slid up my leg again, and I froze. My mind was screaming at me to stop, to say something, but my body wouldn't listen. I was trapped in that moment, unable to break free from the hold they had on me. Julie watched the whole time, her eyes dark and unreadable. What happened next was a blur. I can't remember the exact sequence of events, but I know that at some point things crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. I was no longer in control of my body, of the situation, of anything. I was just a passenger in my own life, watching from the outside as everything fell apart. When it was over, I felt numb. Sarah got up, smoothing out her clothes as if nothing had happened, while Julie sat beside me, her hand resting on my shoulder in what I can only describe as a possessive gesture. "See," she said softly. "That wasn't so bad, was it?" I couldn't respond. My throat was dry, and my mind was racing with 1,000 different thoughts, none of them coherent. I felt sick physically, emotionally, mentally. This wasn't how things were supposed to be. This wasn't how a family was supposed to function. But what could I do? Who could I tell? My dad? He would never believe me. And even if he did, it would destroy him. Julie had wormed her way into his life, into our lives, and I was now caught in the middle of something I didn't fully understand. For days after that night, I avoided both of them. Julie acted as if nothing had happened, going about her usual routine, cooking dinner, cleaning the house, and chatting with my dad on the phone as though she hadn't crossed a line so deeply that it shattered everything I thought I knew. Sarah didn't come over as often, but when she did, she would give me these looks, knowing, teasing, as if she was in on some secret that only the two of us shared. I felt trapped, unable to escape the nightmare that my life had become. I didn't know how to confront Julie, or even if I should. The betrayal was too deep, too tangled in the complexities of our family dynamic. I couldn't destroy my father by telling him the truth, but I also couldn't live with the weight of what had happened pressing down on me every day. The weight of that night clung to me, suffocating in its silence. I spent the next few days in a haze, retreating into my room, trying to bury myself in distractions, video games, movies, anything that would drown out the thoughts swirling in my head. But nothing worked. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the memories of that night, of Julie's unreadable smile and Sarah's predatory touch. I felt violated, confused, and powerless. How could I possibly go on with life as if nothing had happened? I thought about going to Reddit, maybe anonymously posting my story, hoping for some advice from strangers who had no stake in my life. I'd seen so many posts about betrayal, cheating, and messed up family dynamics on there. Surely, someone else had been through something similar. But every time I started to type, my hands would shake and I'd delete everything. Who would believe me? Worse yet, what if someone found out it was me? The idea of my dad reading about what had happened, or even worse, Julie discovering I'd exposed her, terrified me. Days turned into weeks, and I became a ghost in my own house. I avoided Julie at all costs, slipping in and out of rooms when I knew she wouldn't be around. My dad was still busy with work, oblivious to the storm brewing right under his nose, and Sarah acted like everything was normal. When she came over, she would smile at me like we were sharing some private joke, but I couldn't bring myself to meet her gaze. Every time I saw her, my stomach churned with a mix of disgust and fear. Julie, on the other hand, was disturbingly casual. She never brought up that night, never hinted that anything had happened. But there was something different about the way she interacted with me. She was more familiar, touching my shoulder when she walked by, standing too close when we were in the kitchen, her eyes lingering on me longer than they should. It was subtle, but it made my skin crawl. One evening, about a month after that night, my dad came home with an announcement that shook me to my core. "I'm thinking of asking Sarah to move in with us," he said over dinner, his tone casual as if he were talking about the weather. I nearly choked on my food. Julie smiled, her face perfectly serene, as though this idea hadn't come out of nowhere. I stared at my dad, waiting for some kind of punchline, but there wasn't one. Why, I managed to ask, my voice hoarse. "Well, Sarah's been having some financial trouble," my dad explained. "You know how hard it is to live on your own in this economy. And she's practically family at this point, right? It just makes sense." Practically family. The words echoed in my mind, mocking me. Sarah had never been family to me. She was an intruder, a constant reminder of the boundary that had been crossed. The thought of her living in our house, constantly around, was unbearable. I wanted to scream, to tell my dad everything, but I couldn't. The words lodged in my throat like shards of glass. Julie's eyes met mine across the table, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something flicker in them, warning, amusement. I couldn't tell, but it was enough to make me swallow my protest. How could I fight this without tearing our family apart? So, I said nothing. I let the decision happen, like I had no say in my own life. Within a week, Sarah had moved in, her presence infecting every corner of the house. She was always there, always smiling, always watching me with that same look that made my skin crawl. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, trapped between the two women who had turned my life into a twisted nightmare. The days dragged on, each one blurring into the next. I withdrew further into myself, avoiding any situation where I might be alone with either of them. But it was impossible to avoid them forever. The house wasn't that big, and eventually, I'd find myself cornered, whether it was Julie brushing up against me in the hallway or Sarah giving me those knowing looks across the living room. Then one night, everything came to a head. It was late, past midnight, and I couldn't sleep. I'd been tossing and turning for hours, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't control. I finally gave up and went downstairs to get some water, hoping that maybe a drink would calm my nerves. But as I reached the kitchen, I heard voices, Julie's and Sarah's, low and conspiratorial. At first I thought they were just chatting, but something about their tone made me stop in my tracks, just out of sight, listening. He's so tense all the time," Sarah was saying, her voice dripping with amusement. "You think he'd loosen up by now?" "He's young," Julie replied. "It's probably just nerves. He'll come around eventually." They were talking about me. My blood ran cold. "He seemed pretty into it that night," Sarah continued, her voice mocking. "Once he stopped fighting it." I felt sick. They were talking about that night, the night that had ruined everything. Julie laughed softly. "He's still trying to figure out what he wants, but we can help with that." I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt like the walls were closing in on me. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They didn't just see that night as some drunken mistake, they planned it. They had been playing with me, manipulating me, and now they were talking about doing it again. I stepped back, careful not to make any noise, and retreated to my room as fast as I could. My mind was spinning, and I didn't know what to do. I couldn't live like this. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine while they toyed with me, waiting for their next move. The next day, I made a decision. I had to get out. I couldn't stay in that house any longer, not with Julie and Sarah lurking around every corner. I started making plans, looking for places to stay, trying to figure out how I could leave without raising suspicion. But deep down, I knew I couldn't just run away. This wasn't something I could escape from so easily. I needed to confront them. I needed to stand up for myself, no matter how terrifying that thought was. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. One evening, my dad was out late again, and it was just the three of us in the house. I was in my room, pretending to study, when Julie knocked on the door and walked in without waiting for an invitation. She smiled, that same sickeningly sweet smile that had haunted me for weeks. "We need to talk," she said, closing the door behind her. I stood up, my heart racing. "What is there to talk about?" Julie walked over to me, her eyes never leaving mine. "You've been acting strange lately," she said softly, distant. "Sarah and I are worried about you." I couldn't take it anymore. The lies, the manipulation, the pretense, it was all too much. "I know what you did," I said, my voice shaking but determined. Julie raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. "What are you talking about?" That night, I said, my voice rising, "I know it wasn't just some random mistake. You planned it, both of you." For a moment, something flickered in Julie's eyes, surprise. Maybe, but then it was gone, replaced by that same cold, calculating look I'd come to dread. "You're overreacting," she said calmly, taking a step closer to me. "We were just having fun. No one got hurt." "No one got hurt," I repeated, my voice trembling with anger. "You crossed a line, Julie, you and Sarah, you used me. And now you're trying to act like it's no big deal." Julie sighed, as if she were dealing with a child throwing a tantrum. "You're being dramatic. It's not what you think. We care about you, you know that." I shook my head, backing away from her. "No, you don't. You don't care about me. You're just using me. And I'm not going to let you do it anymore." Julie's expression darkened, and for the first time I saw the real her, the one who had been hiding behind that pleasant facade all along. "You don't have a choice," she said coldly. "You live under this roof. You're part of this family, and as long as you're here, you'll do as you're told." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The mask had finally slipped, and now I was staring into the eyes of someone I barely recognized, someone who had betrayed me in the worst possible way. "No," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I'm done. I'm leaving." Julie's eyes narrowed. "Where are you going to go? You have nowhere else. You can't just run away from this." But I wasn't listening anymore. I pushed past her, my mind made up. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay in that house another minute. As I left the room, I heard her voice behind me, low and menacing. "You'll be back," she said. "You always come back." But this time I didn't look back. I walked out the door, into the night, leaving behind the twisted web of lies and betrayal that had trapped me for so long. And as I stepped into the cool air, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks: freedom, real freedom. But I also knew the fight wasn't over.